Fantastic. So, Ryan Galluzzo, I'm the Digital Identity Program Lead for the Applied Cybersecurity Division at NIST, and I'll be providing a quick update today on the Digital Identity Guidelines, or what we all know and love as NIST Special Publication 863. Before we get too far into anything, I did want to just start off and address the elephant in the room right up front. The guidelines are not out yet for revision 4, the draft version. They are going through review. They are going through approval. They should be out imminently, but if anyone was hoping to arrive here and hear me say they will be out on such and such a date, that's unfortunately not going to happen today. So I'm going to start real quick. What are the digital identity guidelines? I think most folks in this room probably have a pretty good understanding of what Special Publication 863 covers, but for those of you who don't, because there might be some in the room, they essentially provide the blueprint for how the U.S. government does digital identity and identity management, particularly when you're talking about identity proofing, authentication, and federation. They also provide the outline and the requirements for how you conduct risk management and how you do your assurance level selection to make sure that you're applying controls appropriately based upon the risk of your application. So provides the requirements, but also provides the process for you to be able to evaluate, understand, and address the controls that are in your environment. 863 Revision 3, which came out in 2017, provided a pretty comprehensive reboot of the identity guidelines. So what had previously been the e-authentication guidelines and was one document was broken out into 4 different documents. The base volume, which covered the digital identity model and risk management, volume A, which covered identity proofing, B, authentication, C, federation, really kind of changed the kind of paradigm which people looked at the different parts and pieces and processes of identity. In particular, it also brought out in that document privacy and usability, elevated those up to be equal to security when you're making some of your risk-based decisions and when you're understanding identity. So Revision 3, 2017 comes out, pretty substantial revision to the document, pretty substantial reboot. They've been out in the wild now for about 5 years, and we have started the process of updating those to try and address it based upon things that we're starting to see today. So why are we making some of these changes? At the end of the day, there's a lot that's changed in our world since 2017, and that's probably an understatement, right? We've experienced a global pandemic that has rapidly driven our benefits programs, our services to digital mediums where they previously weren't. And some of the things that we learned from that, coming out of that, there's new threats, there's new considerations, there's new risks, there's new risk management processes that we have to understand and deal with in order to allow for the guidance to adapt. So the bottom line is a lot's changed since 2017, so we really need to change the guidance. And as we started to go through this process, and in particular David Temashuk and the team that have been leading this for the past 5 years, I've only been with this for about 2 months now, kind of established these core processes, core guidelines and principles for how they wanted to advance and how we wanted to advance the guidance. Number one, we really wanted to advance equity. With Revision 3, we brought privacy and usability to the forefront and elevated those up. Now we want to make sure that we start thinking about equity. What are the impacts, what are the societal impacts of selecting technology and implementing technology in the real world? Something we've learned a lot about. 2, we wanted to emphasize optionality and choice. Right, I think that was something that was brought out in 863 Revision 3, but we want to advance it even further, particularly around identity proofing, where there need to be additional options, mediums, channels, and pathways for individuals to successfully access the benefits that they deserve. Wanted to deter phishing, fraud, and advanced threats. With so many things moving online as a result of the pandemic, there's also a lot more fraud and a lot more attack vectors that we started to explore and we've started to understand throughout the past couple years. And so one major emphasis to align with what was coming out in the OMB and White House guidance on zero trust was to make sure it was much clearer how we can implement phishing-resistant authentication, but also we wanted to make sure that we were addressing fraud in the bigger picture and start to think about new attacks we were starting to see from the enrollment and identity proofing side, for example, social engineering attacks where they tried to manipulate individuals into registering accounts, and looking at things like automated attacks on the enrollment process. So how do we make sure that we are cutting off some of these things iteratively as you work your way through the process? We wanted to address lessons learned from real-world implementations. Again, the guidance has been out for 5 years. There's a lot we can learn from engaging, talking to the community. In 2020, we did a call for comments. But the team has always been going out, engaging with commercial and agencies to understand where are you having success in implementation, where are you having challenges in implementation, where can we continue to advance and integrate new technologies as they come out. We wanted to address, or to emphasize multiple disciplinary risk management. And this is, again, something that 63 started. We wanted to take it to the next level. So those of you familiar with the guidance, and we'll get into it a little bit more here in a couple minutes, there's going to be pretty substantial changes to what we've put in place around the risk management process in the base document. It's going to be a little bit less focused on if-then you get to a certain IL, and more focused on how do you take into account very specific impacts, both from a security perspective and a privacy perspective, usability and equity perspective, to actually make an implementation decision not necessarily driven by compliance, but driven more by actual risk management. And we also wanted to make sure we aligned better with the risk management framework that the U.S. federal government leverages. And finally, we really wanted to clarify and consolidate the requirements a little bit. So at the end of the day, 4 volumes, hundreds of pages, lots of words. You learn over time where those words aren't as clear and concise as they could be or should be. And so one of the things we've always worked and we've been working on in particular is making sure we are as tight as we can possibly be in the language. So what aren't we changing? A lot of it is going to stay the same. It will look and feel very similar, except for a few key areas, to what you all have grown to know and hopefully love over the past few years. The structure is going to be the same. We're going to still have 4 volumes, base document ABC. We're going to continue to decouple the assurance levels. So one of the major changes between what was in the original, we'll call it -2 of 863, and what came out in -3 was that we went from these kind of monolithic LOA 1 through 4 to different assurance levels that were provided for identity assurance, authentication assurance, and federation assurance. We're maintaining that model. We're maintaining the 3 areas. We're also maintaining within those 3 different tiers, AL1 through, or XAL1 through XAL3. Privacy, usability, and security remain paramount. So we're not deprecating or moving or shifting any of those concepts. Nothing is being placed at a higher or lower level. They're going to continue to be some of the primary drivers for all the controls and all the considerations we build in. The one thing that we have done is elevate this kind of concept of equity and inclusion in the evaluation and development of your controls. So what are we changing? And I got a little bit aggressive on the slides here, and we are a little bit behind, so I might not get to each and every line item that we have in here, but I want to make sure everyone gets a bit of a flavor for what it is that we do have going on, what it is that we are changing, and what you can expect to see with this. So first off, with the base document, it's going to be one of the ones that's most substantially changed from what you've seen previously. As I said, we wanted to focus more on processes, we wanted to focus more on risk management and risk-based decision making, and we wanted to give a process that more aligned to what's in the RMF. So looking at things from a decision-making process and evaluating how you might be able to implement controls that don't necessarily negatively impact some of your key populations. So equity, privacy, usability are all built into a concept called tailoring that we're looking at in this version that will allow for you to say, all right, this is what my assurance level might be assessed at, but there might be some non-negotiable or substantial impacts to privacy, equity, and usability that are unacceptable, and we will make risk-based decisions on what we choose to implement in the long run. It considers individual risk much more highly than it did previously. Now, that's not to say 63.3 didn't talk about individual risk. We really wanted to re-emphasize the fact that this is not just about enterprise risk management. With each and every one of these things, particularly from a government perspective, if you're providing benefits, you need to also be thinking about what happens if this individual can't get access to the benefits they deserve. What happens if we can't deliver on the mission that we owe to the individuals that we support? So we wanted to make sure that that was much more focused. You'll see, again, unfortunately, the language is not out and publicly available yet, but what it is, hopefully you'll be able to see that there is a real, true emphasis on making sure that those things are balanced. We updated the digital identity model. And so if those of you familiar with the original document, we've got the kind of federated workflow, and it explains the different roles within there. We've expanded that out quite a bit to try and address both federated, non-federated workflows, to talk a little bit more about new and evolving roles that we're seeing within the ecosystem. So making sure you're addressing things like attribute validators, things, a CSP versus an IDP, and being a bit more clear and concise and offering more options as individuals and organizations start to think about how they choose to implement the requirements of the guidelines. And finally, one of the main things we've done in the base document that is pretty new is really focusing on this idea of continuous improvement and continuous evaluation of your systems, and doing so in a way that integrates with other programs, right? I think one of the things that people have started to observe from the results of the pandemic is while identity operates up front, you've got fraud programs, you've got payment integrity programs, you've got transactional programs that all have critical data that can feed back into understanding how well your identity controls are functioning and operating to make sure that you're constantly improving and addressing risks and threats if they're getting through to your back end. And so what we want to make sure is that as people start to think through their risk management and decision making, they're considering how they tie all this together into a full life cycle, not just for an identity, but for the transactions that are supported by that identity. In 863A, we kind of have a whole new assurance level. So IAL1, if those of you are familiar with it in the past, there was not really any identity proofing there. And so we had heard a lot of feedback from agencies and organizations. Look, we've got IAL no proofing, and we've got IAL2, which is a lot of proofing. And there's not a lot of granularity in there for us to make some decisions on how we might want to implement. So what we have created in the new version is an IAL1 that has fewer controls than IAL2 and targeted to your lower risk applications. We've clarified the concept of trusted referee. Again, this was something that had some time and space dedicated to it in the previous version. We really wanted to make sure as we started to think about options to support more end users getting through without either one, having to go through processes that require biometrics such as facial recognition, or those individuals who simply couldn't get through. We had a set of options for individuals that could move forward in a higher assurance process. So trusted referee, new roles, new descriptions, new clarification of what they do and what they don't do, and we've added the concept of an applicant reference. And this is really someone who can vouch for another individual's situation or considerations to help them move through the process. And we're not just talking about someone who can explain it to them, but someone who can actually potentially provide representation of identity. So it provides that kind of vouching layer that didn't exist before. We've expanded on the use of digital evidence. We want to make sure that things like mobile driver's licenses, they start to get issued and they start to get passed out, these can really truly be parts of your identity proofing process and potentially your authentication process in the future. Things like verifiable credentials, things like assertions coming from a bank or a representation of someone who's authoritative on a specific attribute can all be wrapped into the identity proofing process in the future so that we're not purely reliant upon the traditional processes that we used of attribute validation through, through data providers or, scanning and photographing your driver's license. We've added biometric performance requirements specific to identity proofing. Now, this is one area where we definitely are going to be seeking a lot of input from the outside world, but starting to draw some lines around specifically identity verification processes using biometrics that are done remotely. This is something that I think there's testing, there's standards, but this specific context still deserves a little bit more exploration. And then I think, finally, one of the things that kind of drives almost all of these, and I kind of touched on in our principles, is really providing options and channels wherever we possibly can and providing more granular processes, particularly where we're talking about, processes that alternatively may use face recognition or biometrics. And since we're at FIDO, I'm pretty sure that most people are going to be primarily interested in the authentication side of the house in 863B. It's not one where we've made as many changes as some of the other documents, but the big change and big focus here in 63B is on the concept of phishing resistance. So how do we establish and implement authenticators that support resistance without having to put the onus on the end user to try and figure out how to protect their own credentials, right? And this is done typically and in our guidance through channel binding and verifier name binding. So whether it's something like mutual authenticated TLS or through some kind of name binding at the domain level for the website, that's executed through here. We provide guidance on that, and in particular how it differentiates from some of the other characteristics of other MFA. We elaborate on account recovery options. It's something that we've got a lot of feedback on, and we've tried to focus on, particularly in the context where you might have end users that aren't able to bind 15 or 16 authenticators. We'd love to see them bind. How do we account for those users who might not necessarily have the same volume of accessibility and options as others? Big change here as well, too, is there was a whole bunch of shoulds and should nots in the previous documentation. And I know this group is very focused on killing the passwords, but they still exist. So we do have some changes to the password guidance, mostly going and evolving from, hey, you should do this or you should not do that, in particular when we're talking about, random password rotation. We used to say you should not do that. We're going to say don't do that. When we're talking about complexity, we're going to say don't do that. When we previously said should. So there's a few areas where we've taken and evolved from what were kind of recommendations before, and we're going to push those out there as requirements and see how people react and respond to them. Federation and assertion in 863C. There are some big changes there as well too, primarily around redefining and clarifying the FAL. So I think a lot of the feedback we initially got on it is, these are good, but we really need to better understand how we can implement these in the real world and address these in the real world. So the FALs have largely been redefined and introduced in new ways. We're also addressing for the first time there provisioning APIs and identity APIs and the security of those, which were not really addressed previously. So providing some security and privacy considerations and controls around those. And finally, I think the big thing in 63C as well is introducing more language and discussion of how do you actually establish trust within a federated environment, right? And we're not getting quite so far as to say, here's all the steps to creating a trust framework, but talking a little bit about what should go into your trust agreements, what should you be thinking about as you establish them, and what are the different mechanisms that might exist, both from a kind of runtime, real-time decision or dynamic trust establishment to where are we in a situation where we need to have a more static trust agreement where it's higher risk. So obviously the draft is not out yet, but there are some specific areas that we really, really want to make sure that we get feedback from you all, right? This is, the most important people in finalizing this document don't work at NIST. It's the people that sit in this room here. It's the people who we're going to talk to and engage with and give us feedback on what we've put out there as kind of an initial marker. Huge area that we really want feedback. We want to understand where there's other technologies that we can help pull together for a completely unattended remote process that doesn't require the use of face recognition. We've obviously attempted to build in some optionality in the current draft. We really need more feedback here because this is something that's very critical to us moving forward. We really want to know about what's going to be next for FIDO passkeys and verifiable credentials, mobile driver's license, right? How do we make sure that we're, one, understanding the direction strategically where passkey's going? How do we understand what potential issues or threats might exist around that? So for example, areas we're super interested in getting some feedback on are, where is passkey going from a replication perspective and a revocation perspective, and how do we potentially put some requirements within our guidance to make sure that these are addressed going forward? And I would say probably the last one before we move into questions here, because I'm not going to go through all of these, and when this comes out, you will all see that there's actually way more than like the 6 questions that are on here. We've got a very extensive note to reviewer that will ask pointed questions that we really want feedback. But finally, one of the things we really want to get some feedback on and input on, one of the reasons we're here today as well too, because of some of the things that FIDO is doing around identity verification, is we really wanted to understand how we can better measure some of those identity proofing processes and identity verification processes that rely on biometrics, that rely on presentation attack detection. How much value, how much importance do those bring to the identity proofing process, and how can we measure and understand those going forward and integrate those as metrics and benchmarks for individual organizations and vendors to meet in our implementations going forward? So that's, if you want to get in touch with us, I'm here. You can flag me down. My colleague David Temashuk is here as well too. Or you can send your questions and comments to digcomments@nist.gov. Obviously, the next big step is when the document does get published, there will be a public comment period. It will be an extensive public comment period. It will be open to everybody, so please, please send us your thoughts, send us your questions. We'll also do a round of workshops and engagement to make sure we're getting more direct feedback, more engagement as well too. So we're open to your input, we're open to your questions and comments. And with that, actually, I think, with the next couple minutes here, we can go ahead and take a few questions. Were there none, and I'll get down and I'll... No question? Go ahead. So for those of you who couldn't hear that, the question was essentially, we've included biometric performance requirements, but are there additional metrics we're considering, like around DocAuth and other processes? We're super interested in that, and that's one of the things we do want to talk to the FIDO Alliance team that's working on that kind of process right now. We're also working closely with a couple of other government teams that are looking at that as well too. Yes, we would love to measure. I mean, we're NIST. We do measurement, and we don't do enough measurement in identity right now. So anything that we can learn about how to apply benchmarks here, we really want to. I'm not sure if they'll be ready necessarily for revision 4, but we really want to get to the point where we are measuring things like DocAuth, we're measuring things like risk scoring, all those processes that are a little bit less clear at the moment. So I think we'd love to learn what you know so far. Again, with the guidance, we're going to probably have to figure out what a baseline benchmark looks like, but we'd love to know what you're doing and what directionally they're going. That's part of the reason we're here today.
As we're waiting for this to be released and hopefully be finalized, do you feel that there will be an impact on agencies that have to report to Zero Trust that are trying to implement FIDO and an infrastructure for compliance? And a lot of it relies on 63.3 and doing a wealth of an update to the documents you just said.
Yeah, and for those of you who didn't hear the question, I think the best way to kind of summarize it is there a potential impact for agencies that are looking to do implementations like FIDO today, so implementing now and then the guidance comes out afterwards? I can't say for certain whether there would be too much of an impact. I think one of the things that with 863B is that it's much more evolutionary than a couple of the other changes we made elsewhere. So I don't think that there would be too much of an impact. But again, this is a draft comment period. So if this comes out and the response back is this changes everything, I think that's where we can start having some agency conversations to understand, one, what an update process looks like, at least for systems, and then also understanding what the impact is today. I don't think from a B perspective you're going to see quite as substantial a shift as with some of the other, particularly the base document. Any other questions? Okay, I think that means I'm done for today. Thank you very much. I appreciate you.